called Decentralization is Not Enough. So we're here at a tech conference, and most of us here in this room are tech enthusiasts or otherwise very knowledgeable about tech, right? So we constitute a sort of tech elite, let's say. And there's certain things that we know that people who aren't so immersed in the same worlds that we're immersed in might not know, right? So for instance, we all know to use a password manager, right? Because if you're a naive user and your password is easily guessable, then guess what? The elite hackers are going to easily be able to guess your password using a dictionary tag or something like that. So we know to use a password manager. We just know that. We also just know things like, hey, you should be using two-factor authentication, right? Because you might think that you're on bankofamerica.com and you're signing in with your username and your password, but actually it turns out that you got there from a phishing email, and guess what? The lead hacker is once again pwning you. And if you have two-factor auth set up, especially if you have it set up with OTP, one of those things instead of SMS, then you're protected against this. So we know this. We also know it's a good idea to keep your operating system up to date, right? Because if you're stuck with a phone that has super, super old Android, then congratulations, you're vulnerable to nasty stuff like crack and stage fright and all these horrible vulnerabilities that are going to just infect your phone with malware. So we all know this, right, as knowledgeable techies. So there's a really interesting talk from this guy, Christopher Sagoyan, really great TED talk called Your Smartphone is a Civil Rights Issue, where he points out that if you're living in a society where the wealthy, right, can go out and buy the latest $1,000 iPhone, and they can feel relatively secure in knowing that their operating system is going to be kept up to date, and they have things like encryption built in, right, and they're probably using things like end-to-end encryption, right? Whereas, and that's true as well for like the highest end Android phones, right, which most of us in this room can afford, right? But if you're someone who can only afford a really low-end Android phone that the manufacturer is not going to keep up to date in a couple of years, then if you get stopped by the police or something like that, then the police are going to have a very easy time getting all the data they want off your phone. This is something that we are, this is a situation that we are putting upon disadvantaged communities that does not exist for those of us who are wealthy enough to get around it. So what I would argue is that tech literacy also somewhat creates a two-tiered society, right? Because those of us in this room, who I will just call nerds for short, we know to do things like use two-factor authentication, use an ad blocker. We've got encryption on our phones. We're probably using a very secure, up-to-date browser OS, whereas the rest of society, like the average person, has guessable passwords, right? They might be infected with malware and spyware. They got 10 different toolbars they got installed in their browser, and they don't know how it got there. They don't necessarily have encryption on their phones, and they might have an out-of-date OS or browser. So I want us to keep that in mind. So I'm going to switch gears real quick and talk about this issue, which is that so a lot of us in this room have noticed that centralized social media platforms, especially, have lots of problems, right? They have problems such as fake news, bots, harassment, abuse, some creepy algorithmic content. You guys read this article about YouTube Kids and all this auto-generated content that is just attracting kids' attention is really creepy. And then also just overall issues of surveillance and ads, right? So we're aware of these problems, and so many of the enterprising nerds out there, including many of us in this room, have started to try to attack this problem, right? So we've come up with alternatives to these centralized social media platforms. Things like Mastodon, GNU Social, Scuttlebutt, Patchwork, Rotonde, Beaker Browser, right? We're trying to solve these problems. But one thing I'm noticing is that when I look at a lot of these projects from the perspective of the average user, right? From someone who is not a tech enthusiast, from someone who's not part of the tech elite that we all inhabit, right? They're looking at these things and they're hearing things like, just run this binary on the command line, right? So a nerd says, OK, I'm going to go do that. That sounds great. The average person says, I have no idea what you're talking about. Or we say something like, you just need to choose your server instance or your pub. And the nerd's like, OK, great. That sounds like fun. And the average person is like, what's going on here? What's a server instance? Or this is maybe not so true today because we actually had a session about this, but I do see this come up from time to time. Perhaps the people building these systems, are not really taking the problem of abuse and harassment seriously, right? It's a lot more fun and interesting to think about all the algorithms and the data structures and, draw a bunch of charts and graphs on a board, and we're not thinking about the fundamental problems of how we keep people safe on these platforms, right? Which is very easy if you're someone who is like, hey, cis-het white dude writing this, which is like the majority of the people who write this software, including myself. It's an easy problem to overlook, right? But that's essentially a way of telling a disadvantaged or marginalized person, this is not a platform for you. So my mom is a school teacher, and she is not really a tech enthusiast. She has a super old Windows laptop with a cracked screen, she hopefully will replace soon, and a really old Android phone. And I know for a fact there is no way in the world that she could use Beaker, Rotan, Scuttlebutt. She couldn't even use Mastodon. I'm very sure of it. And that's not OK. We have to be thinking about these problems. We have to be solving these problems. And we have to be making sure that we're not creating a situation where we're just saving ourselves. It's not enough to just save ourselves. It's not enough to just have a little escape valve for nerds while the rest of society is left to do whatever.